Can silence keep a secret even from the bells, even from the frost that writes its pale scripture across the window panes? Can a house that groans like an old animal in winter learn the names of those it holds and still pretend not to hear them breathing? And on the morning men call holy, when the hymn is barely a ribbon of smoke in the throat of dawn, can a single decision slip like a shadow between one heartbeat and the next, and change what a county swears is destiny? Listen, the ash in the hearth remembers, the floorboards remember, the cold remembers, the ledger remembers most of all, and, in Kentucky, in a year the ledgers chose to forget, a man named Benjamin taught silence how to speak. Pause for a moment. If you want to follow real stories that defy time and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our investigations. We return to the house, to the frost, to the name. The house breathed in winter like a chest wrapped too tight. Before day, the boards swelled with cold and sighed. Nails ticked softly inside the timber as if counting. A draught stitched its thin thread under the door and walked the length of the hall, touching each hinge, each latch, each keyhole like a blind finger remembering the faces of locks. Outside, the yard wore its pale shawl of rime, and the paddock fence stood as a row of ribs against a dim sky that had not yet chosen colour. Farther off, the river muttered in its sleep, ice skinning its lips, a sermon without a preacher. On such mornings the chimney spoke first, one cough, then another, until thin smoke gathered at the roofline and spread its grey hand over the fields. The corn crib squatted like a patient animal, the smokehouse kept its own counsel, and the main house, whitewashed to look pure in a county that taught purity like arithmetic, watched itself in every window. Narrow panes held the geometry of order, 6 by 8, 8 by 10. Numbers that pretended the world could be tamed with measure. In the kitchen, iron spoke the oldest language, hinge groan, latch clack, kettle breath. The kettle's mouth puckered and released, and steam wrote soft, vanishing sentences in air. Before the rooster, before the hymn, there was work, the kind that entered bone and slept there, a wintering animal that never quite hibernated. Water fetched from a well that winced when rope scuffed its lip, coals coaxed from sullen ash with the patience taught by weather and necessity, bread set to rise, its hush a small mercy, the scullery floor stone cold enough to teach feet to whisper, the pantry counting jars, sacks, hooks of salt meat, tallies for everything but time. The mistress of the house moved like a fixed star in her own sky, lace at the throat, a keyring at the waist, the little empire of her fingers. She weighed butter with a scale that didn't tremble, and glanced at the household book where neat rows, molasses, candles, kerosene, calico pretended to be the whole story. When she nodded, the maids nodded. When she frowned, the day itself seemed to dim. She liked a floor that did not speak when she crossed it, and a fire that understood how to draw. The master woke later. He preferred his morning as a mirror, his face centred, the world arranged behind him, boots against the wainscoting, the bootjack waiting like a servant that would never die. He shaved with a slow hand, not for fear of blood, but from a custom of lingering over himself. The jaw, the lip, the lines that winter sharpening could not deny. He liked the razor's obedient whisper. He liked control, dressed in small rituals, the precise fold of a cravat, the way leather obeyed polish, the way a door would open if you had the right key or the right voice, which, in such houses, was sometimes the same thing. In the yard, the cabins kept their own calendar, made of aches and weather, song and warning. Smoke rose thinner there as if it had learned to ration breath. Children moved like quiet fish at the edges of sight, quick and vanishing. A woman's laugh would come short and then be folded away. A lullaby would travel on a thread too fine to snare. Work braided the day, chopping, hauling, spinning, patching, lifting, waiting. The bell on the porch told time like a lord tells a story, always from the middle, always in his favour. Winter changed nothing fundamental. It just made the facts sharper. Frost on the pump handle like a warning, frost on the sill like a cold thumb pressed to a mouth, windows that filmed over with a thin cataract. The breath could not clear. The holly cut the day before and stuck in a jug looked festive to those who required that kind of lie. A sprig pinned above the dining room door signalled the season like a ribbon signals a cause. It did not change anything, it just reminded the living to pretend. In the kitchen, knives kept their counsel. Steel cooled from the night held an edge so honest it looked like mercy. The knife rack was a choir of closed mouths. Each blade had a name that only hands knew, the long one that parted roasts into equal testimony, the narrow one that learned the bones of a bird, the stout one that told squash to yield. Polishing had thinned their backs, use had gleamed their faces. A cloth lived by them that smelled of fat and ash and the faint sweet memory of onions. Every house keeps two ledgers, the one scrawled in ink by a hand that trusts its sums, and the one written by days themselves, by shoes that wear the same line into a step, by a rung that remembers a fall, by a hinge that has learned which voice to answer and which to ignore. This house balanced its accounts like a priest who knows the wages of sin, but also who pays them. It pretended that deeds and debts could be folded into columns, tucked into neat corners, and forgotten so long as supper arrived hot. Snow threatened but did not fall. That was the kind of winter it was, a promise held just out of reach, a rumour never seen but believed. The fields wore frost like a thin veil of obedience. The barn cats, each one a stripe or smudge, patrolled with a seriousness that made their smallness feel like a trick. A clock ticked with the white patience of cold. Somewhere a hymn practised itself, not sung yet, just waiting in the throat of morning. The day bent its head and gave itself up. Within all that, something else, a quietness that was not just winter, a hush that felt chosen. The house, in its bones, knew it had become a witness. It knew that certain steps made no sound because they belonged to someone who had learned how to live without announcing himself. The house knew his name because floors learn what lips must never say. He moved in that thin seam between duty and decision, in the corridor where frost wrote its warning, in the margin that every ledger leaves for what cannot be counted. Benjamin. A name that had been spoken softly so long it had become the shape of breath itself. Benjamin who learned the house like a psalm. Benjamin who could read a door with his palm. Benjamin who watched the river rehearse its hardness, and took from it a lesson on how to wait. I learned early that silence could be taught to work, that if you wore it plain as a shirt, if you kept it clean of laughter and argument, it would carry you the way low water carries a leaf, over stones, around roots, past the places a louder thing would catch. My mother taught me to mend shirts at night, and between the stitch and the knot she taught me another kind of sewing, how to thread a day to the next without leaving a bright trace for wolves. Her hands moved through cloth like whispers. Every tear, she said, wants to be mended, not every wound. The house had a mouth, and it was the door. The door had a tongue, and it was the latch. The latch spoke, and you could learn its grammar. I learned its moods, how it jangled for him and sighed for her, and came to my hand like a weary thing that knew me. I learned the stair that must be stepped on the edge to keep it from speaking grief, the floorboard in the second hall that praised or betrayed depending on where you placed your heel. I learned that iron remembers heat and returns it if you ask right. I learned the way a candle listens to breath. Men like him have a habit of writing the world down so they can pretend they own it twice. He wrote in a book kept by the brandy, names that were not names but prices, weights that were not bodies but bales, tallies that were not lives but yields. He flicked ink from his pen like a man flicks seed. Sometimes he read the columns aloud, the way a priest reads weather. The book sounded sure of. That is how paper lies. I kept my own ledger in the flesh, not for balance in this world, but for memory. A scar under the wrist from a nail that rose like a small ambition, a burn on the thumb where iron kissed too long, a notch high on the shin when a log rolled and there was no hand free to say, "Careful." But it is not only the body that takes marks. There are other notches. The day they sold my sister, her face steady, her braid like a question mark they straightened with a rough hand. The morning they took my boy as a driver because his back grew quick and his hands were sure. He was 12 and learned the whip's voice with his mouth closed. The night they came to our door looking for the man from River Bottom and found only our silence, and for that they lifted the roof of our sleep and let the rain in. Each of these an entry, each of these a sum that grows. Silence is not empty. It is a room with everything put away. In my silence I kept a knife's shadow, a key that did not exist, a door I had never opened but could picture in perfect dark. I carried the whole house inside as you carry a tune you are not yet ready to sing. I carried winter too, the way frost thinly teaches each thing to mind its edge. Patience is a cold virtue. It keeps a man from catching fire and burning himself before the time. He liked Christmas with his whole mouth, the song, the punch, the fat on the meat that made his lower lip shine. He liked the way a room behaves when it knows it must be merry. He liked the way a bell makes a sentence sound finished. He liked to look across the table and count what could be counted, the pewter, the china, the faces. He liked a manger set on the sideboard. He did not see the irony, or he preferred not to. He liked to say grace because grace said him. There are debts that no coin pays. There are accounts you keep because truth wants witnesses. I wrote them in a narrow place behind the ribs where breath goes to turn. The page never filled because I would not let it. The entries did not run out because they would not. Even when days came smooth, yes, there were such days, when the sky was nothing but sky and the work fits its picture. Even then, the ledger remained open. It is not vengeance that opens it, it is clarity. I watched him the way winter watches a field, not with hunger but with knowledge. He was not cruel in the way that makes men famous. He was professional, which is a worse cruelty because it expects applause. His hand travelled from paper to plate without washing because the ink belonged to him as much as the bread. Sometimes he would turn a knife on the cloth, sight down its edge with a craftsman's eye, then ease it back to its place. He had a patience for steel. I learned from that too. One night, years before the morning they would sing about, I woke because the house woke. Houses do that when they know a threshold has been crossed. The wind had its hand on the gables and the rafters counted quietly to keep from shaking. I went to the window. The yard held its breath. In the glass I saw my own face double. The outside darkness, the inside faint, both of them me. I remembered my sister's braid. I remembered the boy learning the whip. I remembered the sound of paper deciding what is worth a name, and I understood that the page I had been writing would ask for a final line some day. The pen would not be ink, the ink would not be red. It would be silence turned into speech so sharp it leaves a line the world must read. I did not pray the way he did. I counted, I listened, I learned the lock, I learned the razor. I learned the time a room becomes less guarded than the dark. I learned the softness of a man at dawn, when the world has not yet taught his face its armour. I learned that bells can make even blood feel ceremonious. No, not blood, I don't speak that word. I learned that a throat is a gate not only for air, but for pride. I learned the distance between his bed and the door. 9 steps of oak, the 10th a rug he brought from Lexington, a rug that does not cry when weight meets it. I learned the sound of his breath when he sleeps. It is not a song and not a threat, it is a habit. Every humiliation has a weight. It hangs from the beam of a man's centre the way meat hangs from a hook, quiet, pulling, certain. You do not need to prod it for it to do its work. Time is a kind butcher. He knows how to let gravity assist. I let time work. I added nothing but watching. Sometimes that is the only addition a sum requires before it tips. If you ask me whether I was afraid, I will tell you fear and patience share a bed. They keep each other warm until one decides to rise before the other. I rose first on Christmas morning. Preparation begins as a small correction. The knife whose handle wobbles, tighten the hidden screw. The hinge that protests, oil the shoulder with lard so it learns to whisper. The latch that smiles, teach it to keep its teeth together. Preparation is housekeeping with an ulterior soul. Weeks prior, I tested the kettle's voice. Steam speaks in a key you can recognize with your hand. I learned how quickly water forgets heat when the lid is lifted, how a room absorbs sound when flour dust hangs in it, how footsteps go soft when ash from the hearth kisses a floorboard thinly. I carried a little ash in my apron pocket for practice, like a man carries a talisman. In the pantry I moved a jar half an inch. Each day I set it. No one noticed. That is how you learn the attention of a house, by stealing something and returning it better. The blade I chose did not choose itself. There were others, the long carver with its ceremonial pride, the bone blade with its memory of joints, even the scythe that slept in the shed like a sermon no one wanted to preach. But I chose a razor, plain as a lie, honest as steel. Not his, mine, edge kept with a whetstone the colour of river bottom. When I drew it across the stone, the sound was a quiet saw working through winter. Hold at the right angle, let the stone teach you the kiss. Water on the stone, not too much, patience between strokes. The edge should not gleam, it should breathe. I practiced not the cut but the approach. I learned to become the temperature of the room, warm when the stove bloomed, cooler near the window. The body gives heat like a lantern, the trick is to hood it. I breathed shallower, shorter, until my chest learned the slow grammar of a room at 4 a.m. I learned to carry the weight in my feet like confession. A heart left, part right, nothing extra. I rehearsed doors without touching them. A hand held a hair's width from the knob until the hand and the brass made a covenant. The night before I did nothing that would look like a sign. I salted the pork as usual, set the bread as usual, banked the coals the way an old man banks years. I said nothing to anyone. In the cabin I fixed a loose rung on the chair without comment, and listened to the breath of my boy. Now a man, slow and deep, the sound of water sleeping in a safe bend of river. I sat on the step and watched frost gather on the yard the way old men watch grandchildren play, with tenderness and a knowledge that time is doubling itself before your eyes. I held the razor in my palm until it learned the heat of my will, and then I wrapped it in cloth and set it where tools go to dream. In the middle watch the house belongs to nobody, even the rats let go a little. A clock will confess its old age to you if you keep it company. I kept the clock company until it became my witness. When its hands pointed at the hour the world forgets, I rose. Dash along the boards like a sketched path, a damp cloth to teach the hinge humility. Bare feet, because leather tells a different story. The corridor held its worry until I soothed it by walking where it would not ache. The door to his room had the conceit of importance. It believed itself grand because it opened inward on a man who owned corn calves and the laughter of someone else's children. I offered it my palm until it remembered the kindness of smooth movement. It obeyed me. Doors obey the one who knows their youth and their wound. He slept on his left. Most men do when they have secrets in their right hand. The lamp on the table had died hours before. A wick cindered into a grey prayer. The curtain made a long, patient shape in the cold. A branch outside pressed once at the pane and withdrew, as if a priest had tapped the glass with a finger to say, "Attend." The clock in the hall believed it was alone. I let it keep that belief. Some plans require a speech. Mine required a breath. The razor at my wrist felt like a psalm, something memorized long ago that returns whole when needed. I thought of my mother's hand on cloth. I thought of my sister's braid. I thought of my boy's back when he learned the horse before the horse learned him. I thought of the ledger I had kept in the darker kind of ink. I thought of how winter writes truth across a field and lets spring read it. I did not rehearse the act because life had rehearsed it for me. I rehearsed the leaving. At the washstand, the water was a black mirror. I dipped cloth in it and wrung it until it made the sound of necks turning away. I set it down, folded square, and placed beside it the basin as if I were a servant preparing a gentleman's mourning, which in a country like this is one long morning paid for by other people's nights. I moved in the one place in the room that did not know how to creak, the seam between carpet and plank. My shadow did not lead me, it stayed modest at my heel. The razor opened like a sentence, not wide, just enough to speak. Timing is a tool as sure as steel. Dawn had not yet begun to tell its news to the window. Bells in the county churches, a distance of larks and roofs, were still dreams in someone else's ear. I raised my hand to the place where breath goes to pray. I set the flat of the blade against skin to teach it the idea of cold. A human body will offer a truth when addressed with care. His offered a... I had an image, the old millstone in a field half sunk, the carved circle the colour of winter dusk. The stone does not remember the first grain it ground. It remembers turning. I turned. No gore, no music, just the clean arithmetic of decision and silence agreeing at last. I set the cloth where red would learn to hide its voice. I taught the basin not to ring. I asked the bed to accept a new weight, and it accepted as beds do, without question, without opinion, as if every oath sworn upon sheets were equal in the end. The room exhaled the way a church exhales after a prayer. Ritual completes itself when you refuse to hurry. I closed the razor with the same hand that had opened it. I wiped what needed wiping with reverence fit for an altar no one in that house had ever seen. I straightened the coverlet because winter requires order. I turned a face to one side without hate and saw only a man surprised by a truth too long deferred. No triumph, vengeance is not joy, it is balance speaking low. Leaving is the true art. The door again, the hinge again, the boards like old dogs who will not bark when your hand is on their heads. Down the hall were the ashes' thin counsel. In the kitchen the kettle breathed like a sleeping child. I set the razor back in its cloth and tucked it not where I had planned but where the house told me it would be safe. Behind the brick loose from summer settling, the brick accepted. Outside the yard's frost had grown feathers. The pump looked like a throat clearing. When the bell rang, because bells announce the world even when the world refuses them, I was at the well with a bucket that had learned the weight of ordinary water. I lifted, poured, watched the small silver rope of water climb, then fall. The morning took shape around the sound, innocent of what had been balanced upstairs. Already intertwined above as a single slow moment of right, the house, the breath, the hinge, the razor, the cloth. No gore, only judgment described as ritual. The camera of the mind stays close, the jawline as a horizon at dawn, the window as a pale witness, the basin as a muted bell. The act completes in a still room where silence breaks its long fast and speaks one word, enough. Rumour is a kind of weather. It arrives from everywhere at once and leaves every face damp. By noon the county had learned to whisper. A rider took the road toward the next farm with winter at his heels. He carried the news like a fever. Neighbours put on their coats as if stepping into a new century and rehearsed their concerns with mouths trained by Sundays. Men gathered outside the gate, winter hats in hand, patience on their boots. They said words that made them feel large: security, outrage, order. They said other words softly, as if to themselves: how, when, who. They avoided why. Newspapers, those paper sermons, would later mention the season before they mentioned the man. On the morning of the Saviour's nativity, one sheet would hum as if holiness amplified horror in some necessary math. They wrote the house as a cathedral of innocence, and Christmas as a violated oaths. They wrote Benjamin as a shadow with hands. They wrote the county as a victim and winter as a willing accomplice. They measured the blood with adjectives the way men measure a thunderstorm, with stories of trees. In the yard, the people who truly knew the house said little. A woman kneaded dough with a face calm as river ice. The bread was no different for it. A boy mended a strap with careful stitches that were their own sermon about patience and strength. An old man set his back to a fence post and watched the sky until he had learned enough to lower his head. A girl hummed a line of song no one would remember until 30 years later. Another girl would hum it without knowing why. In the cabins the air lay low. Words were saved as if they cost dear. Eyes met and turned away again with the grace of those who understand that solidarity can look like silence when silence is the only safe shape. "Did you hear?" asked the neighbour woman with the careful bonnet. "On Christmas of all mornings," said the miller, as if the calendar could be wounded. "Someone will answer for this," said a sheriff who liked his reflection in a badge. Men practised being the future by declaring what must be done. The house listened and memorized their sentences, adding them to its second ledger, which is to say, the true one. Inside, the mistress moved like a ghost hired to play herself. The key ring at her waist had less to do. Doors lost interest in her. She wept not only for a husband, but for a world arranged in her favour that had suddenly shown its wires. She asked where God was. The house could have told her, busy everywhere, quiet as frost. They looked for Benjamin with dogs that loved the hunt more than the reason. They rode out toward the thin woods, the one's winter sketches with a delicate pencil, and they found tracks that belonged to the whole yard, the comings and goings of 1,000 mornings. Benjamin had learned to place his foot inside old steps so that the day would not notice. The dogs lost the thread and made circles in the brittle grass like thoughts refusing to land. Men shouted to prove they were not afraid. Crows moved from one bare tree to another like judges changing benches. Some said Benjamin had taken to the river, that he knew a bend where even ice would not catch him. Others said he hid in plain sight because plain sight has always been a better hiding place than any cave. One said he had the help of devils, another that God himself had moved his feet. A third said nothing at all and kept saying nothing until the day he died, because there are favours that last longer than flesh. At night, cabins breathed the careful breath of conspiracy held in the palms like a small flame that wants shelter. Mothers pressed hands to mouths of children who asked sensible questions about justice and sleep. Men sharpened nothing, women folded shirts as if folding prayers. In the corner, an old woman whose eyes had wintered more than most told a story about a river that never forgot a man who spoke to it kindly. "Rivers," she said, "keep counsel with the patient." She rocked a child and made the chair speak like a metronome for a heart that had learned to wait. In town, the paper came out with a headline that preferred thunder to truth. It made the dead man larger than he had deserved, because death rearranges reputation like a maid tidying a room for strangers. The line about Christmas appeared again, bright as tinsel. The sentence that used Benjamin's name treated it like a theft. The sheet did not mention the other ledger, the entries no ink can hold. The house itself changed. Doors hesitated, as if discovering their own hinges. The bell on the porch learned shame. The dining room's holly dried faster than the calendar expected, and left a brown stain shaped like a mouth that had sworn to be merry and failed. The knives were counted twice, and found the same in number but not in story. The razor that remained in its cloth behind the warm brick slept the sleep of objects that had finally told the truth they were forged to tell. Some men called for spectacle. They wanted a body to balance a body, a theatre to pretend at justice. But the world is rarely so tidy outside the page. Days went by, then weeks, then spring with its wet courtship, and the county learned to mention Christmas with a cough. The sheriff called it a case. The neighbours called it a caution. The cabins called it not by name at all, which is a way of keeping something safe. Children grew. A boy who had watched the yard that morning became a man who could mend a harness in the time it takes a clock to forget itself. A girl who had hummed the unremembered tune taught it to a daughter who would sing it to a son who would one day leave Kentucky and stand in a place where the river has no ice but hears stories as if it did. The tune gathered lines of its own, about frost, about a door that learned to be kind to a different hand, about a basin that refused to ring, about a cloth that learned to hide what had to be hidden so that truth could live. If you go there now, if you can find the road that used to be 2 ruts and is now an idea, you will not see a house. You will see a foundation that looks like a mouth with its teeth pulled. You will see a stone that remembers being a step. You will see a lilac that blooms in a corner without a corner to love. You will hear, if you are honest, that you have come to a place where silence tells history better than ink. They will tell it as if it were lightning, sudden and bright, a judgment from a sky that finally opened. That is how stories survive rough hands, smoothed until they gleam, simple as a blade laid flat. But the true story is slower. It moves like winter moving a field, like a river learning its bank, like breath adjusting to the room that will hold it. The true story is patient. It waits until a name is said with respect by those who were denied it. It waits until a child, hearing the hum of a tune with no words, asks, "What is that?" And the mother answers, "It's something the frost taught us." Benjamin's name travelled by ways paper could not count, along quilting frames where women stitched geography and warning, along wagon tongues where iron spoke weather, along hands repeated in sons who learned to grip a tool without letting it own them. His name learned to sit quietly in the mouth and glow, not a flame that draws fire, a coal that keeps a room from freezing. You could warm your hands by it if you believed in the kind of warmth that does not burn. In some tellings he crossed the Ohio on a day kind to fugitives and earned a surname from a minister who knew that water gives more than baptism. In others he died in a piney wood, and the birds kept watch more kindly than men. In the truest telling, the one the house itself would offer if houses could testify. He kept walking inside the people who learned the lesson he had not meant to teach but could not help teaching, that silence can gather a voice so sharp and steady it writes the last line in a book that thought itself endless. Legend takes back roads, it stops at springs, it sits a while with old women whose eyes reflect the fire like letters. It avoids men who want to own it. It prefers winter, because winter makes a person listen. The legend of Benjamin did all these things. It learned to speak in the careful grammar of those who must survive the story they tell. It left out what would tempt spectacle. It kept what would feed endurance. It set a single image at the end, the way a lamp is set in a window for someone who may yet be on the road. Here is that image. A ledger, open on a table that remembers elbows but no names. Not ink, not sums, paper that looks like a winter field. In the margin a thin line drawn by something that did not need a pen. On the far page a space left blank on purpose, as if the book itself had decided not to pretend. Outside the window frost writes its small script on a pane that has seen laughing mouths and weeping ones, and knows the difference. A bell in the distance tries to make a sentence sound final. It cannot. Footsteps pass the door and do not pause. The door, which has learned obedience to the right hand, keeps still. The house, which has memorized the weight of each sorrow it held, finds itself lighter by one. Not because grief lessens, because balance, once spoken, settles like snow no one saw falling. In the yard, a young tree, lilac by smell, old by patience, holds a single bud that believes in spring against what winter has taught. The river speaks, as it always has, in a voice that refuses to choose between mercy and truth. If you ask the ground, it will tell you no names. Ground keeps the most faithful silence of all. But if you set your palm on the old foundation stone, if you incline your head the way a man leans to hear a dying friend, you may catch the faintest sound, Not a blade, not a bell, not even a breath, just the soft turning of a page in a ledger that is also a heart, a house, a county, a country, and somewhere in that turning a word made of frost and patience and winter light, unfinished. The legend ends there because it must, half truth, half winning, all witness. Benjamin walks out of the story the way dawn walks out of night, quietly, taking the dark with it only so far as the dark will go. The rest remains. The cold pane, the hush of boards, the door that learned a new hand, the razor asleep in brick, the cloth that kept its vow, and a silence that no longer hides vengeance because it has learned a greater task, to keep safe the names that were once written only in the body. Listen. The ash remembers, the frost remembers, the river remembers, and somewhere in a county that prefers holidays to history, a bell rings every winter at a certain hour and sounds slightly wrong, as if even iron must admit that an old account, once settled, continues to echo like footsteps leaving a room that will never again be arranged exactly as it was.